have the pleasure of receiving Governor DeLisle Worrell, who is Governor of the Central Bank of Barbados, who is going to be talking about fiscal sustainability in small open economies, the Caribbean experience that is based on a book that he coordinated with a large group of researchers from the Caribbean. Dr. DeLisle Worrell began his second five-year term as governor of the Central Bank of Barbados on November 1st, 2014, having been first appointed in 2009. Dr. Worrell is an economist who founded the research department of the central bank in 1973 and served with the bank until 1998, by which the time he was deputy governor with responsibilities for research, management information systems, and banking supervision. Between 1998 and 2008, Dr. Worrell worked with the International Monetary Fund, focusing on monetary policy, financial stability, and stress testing in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Latvia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Haiti, the Central Caribbean Currency Union, the Gambia, Ghana, Sao Tome, the Comoros, and Tanzania. More recently, Dr. Worrell served as the executive director of the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in economics from the University of West Indies and a PhD in the same discipline from McGill University. Dr. Worrell is the author of Policies for Stabilization and Growth in Small Very Open Economies. That was a book published by the Group of 30 in 2012, and Small Island Economies by Prager Publishers in 1987. His publications on money and banking, exchange rate policy and the balance of payments, fiscal policy, the economic implications of size, and the comparative economic performance of Caribbean and South Pacific economies may be found on websites of the International Monetary Fund, the Central Bank of Barbados, the Caribbean Center for Money and Finance, and international journals and publications. Dr. Worrell has held research fellowships at the Smithsonian Institution, the Peterson Institute, and the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, and also at Yale University, Princeton University, and the University of the West Indies. He has been a consultant to the Inter-American Development Bank, the Foundation for Development Cooperation in Brisbane, Australia, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the World Bank, the UN Economic and Social Council, and the Caribbean Community Secretariat. He was General Chairperson of the International Symposium on Forecasting in 1997 and a member of the Program Committee of the International Economic Association Moscow Congress of 1992. Dr. Worrell is married to Monica Drayton. So without further ado, let me let Dr. Worrell to talk to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alberto. And I want to talk today about a book that we're very excited about. It's available for free download at the Central Bank of Barbados website, and it will be shortly available on Amazon.com. Our book, Fiscal Sustainability and Debt in Small Open Economies, offers the most reliable indicator of the risk of crisis in the Caribbean and economies of similar size. That indicator is the extent of pressure on the foreign exchange reserves of the central bank. Where servicing of foreign debt absorbs a large percentage of foreign earnings, that risk is immediately apparent. Any event that reduces earnings or bumps up foreign spending may leave the country short of the foreign exchange it needs to cover debt service. Our book points out that a small open economy may experience unsustainable pressure on foreign exchange, even if the deficit is financed by domestic debt. This will not be the case if the deficit is financed through the accumulation of domestic finance by banks, insurance companies, and other private institutions and individuals. However, in cases where the central bank advances money to fund the deficit, this adds to total spending power. Everything that is bought in our very open economies has a high content of imports. The higher the spending, the more imports are needed, and the greater the pressure on foreign exchange. Consideration of the impact on foreign exchange market pressure, of the size of the fiscal deficit, and how that deficit is financed, gives us a reliable indicator of the risk of crisis. If foreign reserves remain above a level the market is comfortable with, fiscal policy is sustainable. But if a downtrend is not arrested before reserves cross the threshold comfort level, there is a real danger of capital flight to other countries. In that case, the country could quickly find itself unable to meet its debt obligations. Our indicator is far more reliable than is the debt to GDP ratio, which is the measure commonly employed. A high debt to GDP ratio is like being overweight. Being overweight increases your risk of heart disease and stroke, but many overweight people die of other causes, and many live to ripe old ages. Similarly, a high debt to GDP ratio is often undesirable, but it is not a reliable indicator of the risk of anything in particular. Our book covers several Caribbean countries, and it includes details of the economic performance, fiscal policy, and debt management of the countries covered, including those that have undergone recent restructurings. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'm going to focus on the methodology that we use for assessing their fiscal sustainability, because that methodology is applicable to all small open economies who, like the Caribbean countries, have what I called a hard foreign exchange constraint. And so let me proceed to say a little bit about the methodology. The book aims to provide a practical, intuitive measure. It's okay. A practical, intuitive method of measuring how far the country may be from a crisis that threatens living standards. This assessment is based on fiscal and debt position and the overall fiscal strategy. And it asks the question, what does that overall strategy and the beginning fiscal and debt position have for, what implications do these have for pressure on the foreign exchange market? The intuition is that for a small open economy, extreme foreign exchange market pressure results in a crisis that will ultimately depress living standards. Therefore, fiscal policies that generate extreme foreign exchange pressure or that are expected to generate such pressure within the forecast period that economic policy makers normally use, which is about 5 years, such pressures are not sustainable. And a sustainable fiscal strategy is one that will not lead to a financial balance of payments or economic crisis that will cause an avoidable decline in living standards for the majority of the population. The key intuition is that the Caribbean is in a class of economies that face a hard foreign exchange constraint. That is, one that is unaffected by relative price changes. And I have a reference there to my, which is fully explained at the end of the presentation, to my publication, which is on the website of the Group of 30, which speaks to the nature of that hard foreign exchange constraint. In countries that have a hard foreign exchange constraint, because the relative prices will not serve to adjust the demand and supply of foreign exchange, equilibrium on the balance of payments must be achieved through the management of aggregate demand and hence the demand for imports. If you aren't able to adjust aggregate demand and the demand for imports in line with the available foreign exchange supply, then you're going to lose foreign reserves and eventually there will be a crisis of the balance of payments. It follows, therefore, that if the fiscal and debt strategy increases that risk of balance of payments disequilibrium, it will not be sustainable. And our methodology provides a measure of that risk. As I said, our time horizon is 5 years, and that is because 5 years is the practical time horizon that most policymakers are comfortable with. If the expected crisis is further out, a 5-year horizon offers you sufficient time to make changes in the fiscal strategy so that you avert the crisis. Also, the margin of error in forecasts beyond 5 years is too wide to give a practical guide to what you must do today. The risk of a balance of payments crisis is a better indicator of the sustainability of fiscal strategies than is the debt to GDP ratio. The loss of foreign exchange reserves and the possibility of a balance of payments crisis is a very real danger, especially for small open economies, and its consequences for living standards are obvious. Recent publications by the IMF have admitted that small open economies have to care about the external balance, the balance of payments, and what happens, what the implications are for the exchange rate. In any economy, what matters is not the level of debt per se, but the impact of debt service on the fiscal balance and the flexibility of fiscal management to accommodate debt service along with government's other priorities in ways that do not threaten to depress living standards. And that is a measure that includes, as the description implies, so many variables and judgments that you cannot come to any single determination, impartial determination of where a threshold might lie. There is no urgency to reduce a debt to GDP ratio. And that is the ratio that all the conventional indicators, including the influential IMF debt sustainability analysis, use as their point of departure in determining what the urgency in adjusting your debt management strategy. So I'm saying that because the debt to GDP ratio does not define a point at which something bad is going to happen, then there is no urgency in reducing it. Recall my analogy to the problem of being overweight. However, there is urgency to address the balance of payments crisis, because if you do not, then there will be a serious crisis. What is more is that there is no causal link between debt to GDP ratios and economic crises. And if you look at the debt to GDP ratios of many countries, you'll see that there are prosperous countries like Singapore which have very high debt to GDP ratios. There also is a question which comes up often in these discussions about growth. Should we not worry about growth? We should. But growth in a foreign exchange constrained economy cannot take place unless there is an increase in the supply of foreign exchange. If you're a small open economy, then you have no market power. And therefore, the only way in which you can secure an increase in foreign exchange is increasing your productivity and addressing other aspects of the capacity to supply and the supply and the cost of supply. And these are the things that ultimately determine your rate of growth, and they're not related in any deterministic way to the level of debt. What is more, fiscal debt, fiscal policy, and the financing implications that are associated with it cannot stimulate growth unless the government is able to borrow externally. The foreign exchange constraint is equally important for the fiscal as it is for the rest of the economy. And therefore, what matters is the external debt service burden. So once again, it comes down to the implications for the balance of payments. Or the strength of our method is that it uses observed market behavior to inform the crisis threshold, and it gives robust results irrespective of the macro model that is used to imply or to infer or to derive the impact of the fiscal strategy on the balance of payments. In our book, we use a very simple relationship, which I will speak to in a few minutes, but the relationship can be in practice expressed as in a sophisticated model as is available to the authorities. The limitation is that it applies only to economies that face a binding constraint on the balance of payments. So for large economies which have the capacity to do import substitution and which have market power in that their supply in the market will affect the price and therefore their relative price relative to others, for those economies, then this method will not give a good indicator. It cannot be used for large and diverse economies. But for small open economies that face a foreign exchange constraint, it is a very powerful tool. So let me speak to the methodology, and it's really very simple. The core of the model is the core of the methodology is a model of the impact of fiscal policy and deficit financing, taking account both of domestic and foreign financing, the impact that has on the balance of payments. In all our countries, or market economies, there is an observed threshold of foreign exchange reserves beyond which, if the central bank loses reserves too quickly, markets infer that exchange market pressure is excessive, and economic agents will take defensive positions, mostly by way of capital flight. So, and this applies whether your exchange rate is pegged or whether it is floating. Under our model, therefore, we measure the impact of fiscal policy on the balance of payments and the implied effect on the foreign reserves, on foreign market, exchange market pressure. Should that pressure cause reserves to fall below a threshold level, which is defined by the market sentiment, what the market feels comfortable with, then that fiscal policy is judged to be unsustainable. The kernel of our model, therefore, is the relationship of fiscal expansion or contraction to the overall balance of payments and the demand and supply of foreign exchange. And in our simple exposition, for the purposes of the book, we just use two parameters to define that. A parameter which we call alpha, which measures the impact of fiscal changes on aggregate spending within the economy, and beta, which is the import propensity, which is the relationship of imports to that aggregate spending. Okay. The preferred measure for the fiscal impact on spending for the purposes of our model is the central bank credit to government. A central bank credit to government impacts aggregate spending in a way that worsens the balance of payments. If you compare the credit to government, which adds to the spending stream within the economy, to financing that comes from abroad, that will also add to the spending stream, but it will bring with it foreign currency, which contributes to help to finance the additional imports that will come along with the additional spending. And that minimizes the balance of payments impact, the adverse balance of payments impact. Similarly, where the source of finance is domestic finance, which is generated from surpluses within the domestic system and therefore does not result in any additional money creation, monetary easing by the central bank, there is no additional wealth over and above that which is associated with the changes in income. And therefore, there are no additional aggregate expenditure effects. So the impact on the balance of payments will not be severe. So the alpha and beta that we use to express, as I say, the relationship between the fiscal impulse and the total spending power within the economy, that's alpha, and beta, the impact that additional spending has on imports. Those are summary coefficients which are encapsulate a number of diverse relationships, so that it's factors such as the purpose and durability of imports, the purposes for which central bank advances money to government, whether that does in fact create additional spending power. There are certain types of advances, for example, economic bailouts, where the central bank doesn't necessarily end up adding to the money supply, so that there's a change in ownership, but not necessarily a quick change in the total money supply. These are all factors which are country and incident specific and would have to be taken account of in specific circumstances. So in practice, policymakers would use structural models rather than the simplified assumptions that we use for the purposes of sort of exposition of the methodology. So the tests are that we report in the book. We calculate the impact of money creation. We do simulations of the impact of money creation on the level of foreign reserves. We compare the result with an assumed minimum threshold level, which would in practice be based on observation of market perceptions. And we argue that if the fiscal policy with the implied money creation drives reserves below that level, the level of market comfort, for successive years, the fiscal strategy is unsustainable. And we also report stress tests where we increase the amount of money creation by increments to see how far the fiscal strategy is away from what you may call the unsustainable threshold. And the book reports the nice thing about the methodology is that you can go back and apply it for past periods and sort of compare what the methodology indicates against what actually took place. And I just give in the paper a couple of illustrations from one of the countries that we report in the book. This one is for Aruba. The blue line, the solid line, is the actual level of reserves, which we calculated as a result of, well, which was actually observed. The threshold level is represented by the black dashed line. So that's the actual picture. It says that for most of the period of the 2000s, and certainly since the financial crisis, in economic and financial crisis in 2008, which is the period that the book mainly concentrates on, there has been little or no risk of unsustainability in the case of Aruba. The next slide is our simulations. We said, so what if there had been money creation in Aruba to the extent of 2% of GDP? And that's the red line you would have seen. You can see that the foreign reserves would have deteriorated, but in recent times they would still have remained more than ample. And the same is the case if we had actually, there had been a deficit which required the central bank to create money to the extent of 5% of GDP. As you know, these are very high numbers. So it indicates that really there is virtually no risk of unsustainability for the fiscal situation in Aruba. The next slide shows the progressive stress test. So if you added increments of 1% in terms of fiscal of central bank money creation as a result of larger and larger fiscal deficits, you can see that even with as much as 10% pressure, you would have fallen below the assumed threshold, and therefore you probably would have had capital flight, which means that the line would not have declined in that straight line fashion. But if people were fairly comfortable with that underlying strategy, then you can see that it would have been sustainable even at very extreme assumptions about exchange market pressure. So that really is to illustrate the methodology. What we do, I have a summary table. Next slide. But before I get there, just to reiterate that the thresholds are based on market perceptions, which will vary from country to country, and that factors such as the credibility of fiscal policy, apprehensions about devaluation, apprehensions about debt restructuring, and the impact that fears and information of all kinds might have on the nervousness within the capital market are not taken into account in this analysis, though they are of crucial importance in practice. I include a summary of the results that we obtain from the use of this methodology with what we have gleaned from recent reports, staff reports by the IMF of their conclusions with respect to the sustainability of fiscal policies, to show the comparabilities and contrasts. So you can see that in the case of Aruba, we are actually agreeing with the IMF assessment. The case of Bahamas, we are actually, a little more worried than the IMF is. In the case of Barbados, it's the opposite, that the IMF thinks that sustainability risks are significant. Our methodology says they're not. Next slide. For Belize, we both in methodologies suggest there is need for caution. Jamaica, Again, both methodologies indicate a relatively high risk. For Suriname, the risks are considered low by both methodologies. And in the case of the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, our methodology only allows us to make statements with respect to the union as a whole. And there, the external risks are very low. The IMF does not speak to, I don't think they have a report that speaks to the union as a whole. Next slide. The general conclusion that, with respect to that our methodology enables us to confirm is that risks within the Caribbean in general have, with one or two exceptions, been relatively low risk of crisis. And actual practice has confirmed that, because there has actually been no financial or balance of payments crisis anywhere in the Caribbean since the 2008 economic and financial crisis. It is true that 4 countries, that is Jamaica, Belize, St. Kitts, and Grenada, have chosen to restructure debt. But that was not because the debt can be said to have been unsustainable in the sense that we use that term. That there was an approximate risk of a crisis. In every case, the decision to restructure was a deliberate choice based on other considerations. So in none of those 4 cases was it that the government was unable to repay. And in that sense, we argue that it was not a question of sustainability per se. And that's an important point. Because sustainability is not the only reason that you might want to not to persist with a particular fiscal strategy. So in conclusion, measures of sustainability based on foreign exchange market pressure are preferred for countries that are small, that are open, and that face a foreign exchange constraint that they cannot alleviate by relative price changes. They're preferred because they measure the ability to pay in an unambiguous manner. Our methodology equips policymakers with stress testing tools that they're able to measure the sustainability risk. In other words, they're able to say at any given point in time, how close are we to incurring, or what is the level of risk that we have that the current policy may become unsustainable. And in contrast, the indicator that is commonly used is actually a poor predictor of fiscal sustainability or debt default risk. On the issue of the foreign exchange constrained economy, I refer you to my occasional paper published by the Group of 30 in 2012. It's called Policies for Stabilization and Growth in Small, Very Open Economies. That's it, folks. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Governor. So, what we'll do is we'll take questions here in the chat window. Either here in the chat window, or you can do it also by raising your hand on the status bar, and then we can open your microphone. So, Governor, could you mention a little bit about how the methodology has to be adjusted by the exchange rate regime that a country has, and how broad or how applicable do you think that this methodology is for other countries? Because the focus here is on small open economies, or very small open economies. So Could you mention a little bit about that, please?
Yes. The key is the whether the economy faces actually a small economy with limited possibilities for import substitution. So the contrast is between most of the economies of the Caribbean and possibly Central America, who specialize in a limited number of foreign exchange earning sectors that they are able to ramp up to internationally competitive production. And that contrasts with the range of imports that a modern economy needs in order for inputs as well as for consumption. Those economies, in contrast to, say, Mexico or Brazil, have limited capacity for, first of all, influencing markets by virtue of their production, and also import substitution if foreign goods become more expensive than domestic goods. So that is what my 2012 monograph speaks to, and that is what makes the foreign exchange constraint something that I call hard, that it can't be alleviated by devaluation or by any other price adjustment. For all those economies, irrespective of whether they have a pegged exchange rate, a floating exchange rate, or whatever the nature of that exchange regime, this methodology applies because they all have to be concerned about that balance between foreign exchange inflows and foreign exchange outflows. So it doesn't matter the regime, so long as you fall into the category of foreign exchange constrained economies.
Thank you very much, Robert. So I say you, Cairo is typing a question, and let me see.
It's a long question.
The thing is, as people type, you see, so every time they are typing, you see the message that they are typing.
I'm seeing that.
But say you also, if you would like, I can open your microphone so that you can ask the question directly if you think it is.
No, I'm good.
So, Governor, well, sir, so you finishes. Just to understand, the book has many chapters. I guess some of them explain the methodology, some others with special country cases. Is that right?
Yes, the book also, some readers have found it valuable because, it was, we had collaborators from countries across the Caribbean, including the countries which have had debt restructurings of one kind or another in recent times, the four that I mentioned. And so there is some detail on those restructurings, the motivations for them, which substantiates our argument that it was not a question in any of those cases that the fiscal there were other options. The judgment was made in each of those cases that the other options for accommodating to full debt service on the outstanding terms were, for one reason or another, less beneficial than the option of debt restructuring. It wasn't that they absolutely were unable to meet the obligation.
Now we have Beverly and Sergio both typing. So if you don't mind, we can give them some seconds for them to finish. And while I shared the link where we found the latest version of the book in the
Good.
bank's website, so I think people can download it there. So Beverly asks if in the environment of low growth and increasing debt in the region, can fiscal sustainability be achieved anytime soon?
Yes, what we are arguing is that the reasons that the fiscal throughout the region, is sustainable in the sense that if we continue with the existing fiscal strategies, nothing will happen. There's not going to be any crisis as a result of the fiscal and so on. But there are reasons relating to the efficiency of our public sectors, the growth or lack thereof of productivity within the public sector, the delivery of public services, the balance between ability to pay and actual notions of fees for service, questions relating to the impact of fiscal policy on income equality and access to provision of health and education and so on. All of these are factors which need to be addressed and for which many fundamental changes have to be undertaken in our fiscal policies. So it's not a question of sustainability at all, but a question of public sector reform so that we have a more efficient and effective public sector that delivers public goods and services in an efficient and cost-effective manner. The other point I want to make is that insofar as the debt is largely domestic debt, then there is really no need to reduce the actual quantum of debt, so long as the debt is in domestic currency. And that efforts to reduce the quantum of debt actually create a problem for the holders of that debt. The majority of those holders are interested in, for them, the debt is a source of income. So the debt instruments represent, what they're interested in is the interest return that they are able to earn on the debt instruments that they hold. So anytime that you return the principal to them, you create a problem because then they have to find other employment for that principal. And for institutions like pension funds, insurance companies, and others who have an interest in investment for the long term, there often is very little alternative for them in terms of investments that will yield a dependable rate of return with as little risk as in the case of the sovereign, speaking strictly about domestic debt. Okay, I'm seeing Sergio's questions now. A question now. Can you open the?
No, it's on the notebook.
Okay, foreign reserves also contain SDRs. Does this have an effect on the study or the study? Yes, we looked at the total. So from time to time, the revaluation or otherwise of the SDR does affect the level of foreign reserves, sometimes positively. Most recently, we had a negative effect. But for most countries, the outstanding level of foreign reserves is not affected to a sufficiently large extent by the revaluations to make a great difference, which is fortunate because it's impossible to forecast how the value of the SDR relative to the domestic currency will evolve over time. Okay, Beverly's question is, from what I'm saying, we have a number of structural issues, and can we address these issues outside the fiscal framework? No, and that is not my argument. My argument is not that we can avoid the fiscal restructuring that does address the notions that I just mentioned, the efficiency of government, the delivery of public services, the question of whether whether the society feels that there is an equitable case for the payment of fee for service. But those are issues which need to be addressed in a deliberate and measured way on the basis of appropriate analysis. And they're not a crisis matter. They're not something that you have to take emergency measures to accommodate. And the danger really of focusing, of representing the issue of fiscal, structural fiscal reform as an issue of sustainability. The danger there is that there is a false sense of urgency, that people feel that you have to go to extreme measures to reduce the debt, whereas a more sensible and appropriate policy focuses on the nature of productivity within the public sector, the organizational structures within the public sector, process reform, leadership, and technology within the public sector. These kinds of issues, which will not in any way affect the top end structure of the debt.
If there are no further questions, perhaps we can thank Governor Worrell for this very interesting presentation.
I think Beverly has a response.
Okay. Yeah, she's still writing. So let me.
And the question is, does governance play any role? Absolutely. That is at the core of the issue, really. And I think that that is part of the problem that we face, that because there is this exclusive focus on debt, people are taking their eye off the ball in a sense, because it is about governance. It is about our structures of governance. And we are not addressing these issues. We are not addressing the fact that, for the productivity effects, for the changes that we need to contemplate in how we deliver services, what services people pay for, what services, how do you effectively protect the sort of most at risk within the society, within changing societies. How do you, because our societies are changing. The nature of even the composition of the at-risk population is changing. You have an aging population. You have people living to older ages and so on. And we are not sort of focusing. As a matter of fact, I mentioned pensions, for example. And the fact that a lot of pension funds and pensioners hold government debt instruments. When you restructure those instruments, you're actually depriving the holders of income. And these are the kinds of issues that I think are being ignored because people are not focusing on the governance issues, but they're actually focusing exclusively on the level of debt.
Governor, one last question. This may be out of scope of the paper, the presentation, but are there any thoughts within the book that could be useful, say, for avoiding issues like those that Greece is experiencing? Situations like the ones that I know that it is a very different context because of the monetary arrangement, but still
Absolutely.
lessons that can be driven from the study.
Right, absolutely. I think that for a country like Greece, the issue really is redistribution. And it's tied in with the issues relating to the fiscal restructuring, because that's really the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter really in Greece is not about the debt level per se. It is that the EU perceives that the structure of the fiscal structure in Greece is inappropriate. That their pensions are too generous, that the retirement age is too low, that the Greeks have not taken the fiscal restructuring measures which bring them in line with the rest of Europe. And so, I think that it is true for Greece as it is true for all countries, that this, for all small open economies, that the focus on the debt issue is misplaced. That the real issue is an issue of transfer mechanism and the relative fiscal policies and strategies of Greece relative to the euro. Greece, the Germans, the French, the Spaniards, everybody is saying Greece has refused to play by the fiscal rules. You cannot contain that situation through the debt management. And I think that the failure of the EU to focus on that as the real issue, and to deal with it, leads to this situation where every 6 months you have a new crisis, and the Greeks are fed up with it. So thanks for that question.
Thank you very much, Governor, and thank you all the attendees for participating in today's seminar. We'll have a 1 month break to do some research ourselves, but on August 4 we'll return with Larry Cristiano from Northwestern University, who will be talking about the chapter that he's preparing on unemployment for the forthcoming handbook on macroeconomics. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, also, Alberto, and thanks for everyone for joining us. Thanks for this opportunity. I think we have something that we are very excited about, and we hope that other countries will adopt this methodology. So, thanks for the opportunity.